All right. Next couple of lectures cover conifers, or trees we generally refer to as pine trees, although pines are only one category of conifers. Conifers are also generically referred to as evergreens because their needles stay on for longer than one season, unlike deciduous trees like oaks and maples. Have to excuse me as I'm recording this. I've got a kind of a scratchy throat. Allergies a little bit, I think. But anyway, I shall soldier on. All right, so some general characteristics of conifers. They're in a family of plants that are called gymnosperms as opposed to angiosperm. Gymnosperm literally means naked seed. So in other words, when you look at a conifer, you typically think of cones, pine cones, as the type of the place where the seeds are, and the seeds are inside of the scales of those cones. They're not enclosed in a fruit like would typically be on plants in the angiosperm group. All conifers are, of course, photosynthetic autotrophs. They're well-developed vascular tissue, unlike, say, aquatic plants, which just get their moisture and nutrients generally through diffusion. So they have well-developed xylem that conveys water up and nutrients up, and then phloem that conveys the food down from the leaves or needles down through the stems and into the roots and well, everywhere else they're needed, I guess. And got a lot of really interesting conifers in California. A number of them that are endemic to California. About half of them are endemic. We used the word endemic earlier in the semester. Give you just a second to see if you can recall what that means before I tell you. So endemic species are those that are only found somewhere in particular in the world. So for example, again, about half of these conifers are only found in California, nowhere else in the rest of the world. The conifers in general, from a timber standpoint, are considered softwoods as opposed to hardwoods. Again, things like oak, maple are generally considered hardwoods. Conifers still have leaves, although we typically refer to them as needles. But they are needle-like leaves, if you want to be biologically correct. Needle-like or scale-like leaves. And as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of conifers are evergreen. There are a couple of exceptions, species that aren't found in California, but the members of the larch family, tamaracks, drop their needles every year like an oak would. And there's another relative to the redwood trees that's not found in North America, but it drops its needles every year. Just a quick little side story about that. The place that I started when I first got out of college, teaching down near Fresno, there were a couple of these dawn redwoods on campus, and that's the other type of redwood that is deciduous, that again drops its needles every year. And there was one point before I got there that one of the grounds people saw these trees and knew they were, conifers, and had saw that they dropped all their needles and proceeded to start cutting them down because he thought they were dead. And of course, fortunately, somebody saw what they were doing, and they had already cut one down, I guess, but stopped them from cutting all of them down. They were planted on campus, and they were used in classes like the ones I taught. But because it was a pine tree, a type of pine tree that everyone knows, has needles on it all the time, as soon as it dropped its needles in the fall, he thought it was dying, and again wanted to cut him down. But again, those are fairly unique, rare when it comes to conifers that drop their needles. And of course, these plants live in a variety of habitats, from very dry areas like the valley here in California, and those have to be very drought tolerant. And you have species of pines that exist in very high elevations, up above 10 or 12,000 feet, where it's very cold most of the time, and so those species also are very much adapted to these very, very cold climates they live in. So again, when we think about conifers, we think cone, because that's the distinct reproductive structure. Conifers have both male and female cones. Usually the female cones are much larger, and they're the ones that are, woody, that actually contain the seeds. And you can actually identify any species of conifer if you just had a cone. Every cone for every species of conifer is unique. And when I taught native plant ID, that was the first part of the class, is we went through and studied just the cones for identifying species. The male cones are usually pretty small. People oftentimes think they're just little cones that haven't grown yet because they're much smaller. And of course, those produce the pollen, and the pollen then finds the female cone and ultimately, hopefully, fertilizes the embryos inside, which grow and develop into seeds. But again, think of the cone as the equivalent to a flower in any other plant, because that's where the seeds are found. There are several genera that we'll look at here briefly. The genus Pinus, which are the pines, Tsuga, which are the hemlocks, Picea, which are the spruces, the true firs, which are abies. There also are false firs, which the Douglas fir belongs to. And then there are some members in the cypress family, typically Cupressaceae, this cypress family, which contains a bunch of different genera. That's why there isn't just one listed there. So we'll look at each of these a little bit, along with, again, the Doug fir, which is the pseudo-Tsuga, the false fir, pseudo meaning false. And then Taxus brevifolia, which is the Pacific yew. We also have a conifer called California nutmeg, and it has a big, almost acorn-looking seed, although it is fleshy, not hard like an acorn. The yew and the nutmeg are not nearly as widespread as most of the other conifers. They're a lot rarer, but still examples of conifers found in California. So we'll look at each of the genera. Genera is plural for genus. We'll look at each of the genera and talk about some key characteristics, things that make a pine and not a fir, for example. And then we'll look at some of the typical species that you would come across as you're out and about in California. So, key characteristics of the members of the genus Pinus include needles or needle-like leaves, and typically they're in bundles of 2, 3, or 5. And again, that's one way to help you identify what type of pine it is by how many needles are found in the bundle. Of course, the female cones are very conspicuous, generally pretty large. A lot of the members of the genus Pinus have thicker bark, which helps them be fire resistant. Not necessarily fireproof, but fire resistant. Because of how common wildfires are in the West, these trees had to evolve and adapt to that. Members of the genus Pinus are the most common in California and probably throughout the United States. 20 species native to California alone. And we'll start with the one that's down here in the valley, that you probably, if you live in the valley or the lower foothills, you probably have these nearby. The gray pine, Pinus sabiniana. Gray pine gets its name because although, as you can tell, the needles are still green, right? They are, and it's kind of tricky. You'll hear needle descriptions like gray-green, blue-green, yellow-green. They're still all green, but you have to kind of use your creative side a little bit and think of these, and we'll look at these compared to other pines. These are a little more faded green, again, what we might call gray-green. And of course, a very large woody cone that can easily weigh a couple of pounds for the really big ones. These are definitely cones you would not want to fall out of a tree and hit you anywhere, because they could certainly do some serious damage. The other thing about the gray pine is that, again, the genus Pinus and species Sabiniana, but there are a lot of other common names that you might hear for the gray pine. It's often called foothill pine because of where it grows, ghost pine, maybe because of, kind of the pale color, bull pine, digger pine, because the sort of almost a derogatory term that was used to describe some of the Native Americans that utilized this tree, the seeds. Certainly pine nuts, the seed of the pine tree are really an important wildlife species as well as. All right. I just had to answer a phone there. Normally I don't mess with phone, but that was one that I had to take. So I'll have to get my head back in the game here now and think about where I was. But so again, lots of common names for this tree, which is why, as a scientist, we use the Latin name. There's only one Latin name, despite the fact that there's maybe 6 common names that different people use. We call gray pine, one of the common names being foothill pine because of where it's found. It typically occurs in the dry foothills that encircle the Valley of California. You can see the gray shaded area that basically completes a ring around the valley, the Great Central Valley of California. So it exists in a dry foothill oak woodland type of habitat, along with say blue oaks, interior live oak, manzanita, poison oak, those kinds of plants. And it's able to exist in these kinds of areas because it is a very drought adapted plant, much like the blue oak that it exists with. It has a fairly open crown, which refers to the fact that the foliage, the needles on the tree are not super densely packed in. In other words, a fair amount of light can still make it through the crown. And unlike a lot of the other pines, the gray pine tends to have multiple trunks coming up from the base rather than a single straighter trunk. So it tends to be a little more gnarly looking. And again, as you look at the map here, you can see that the range, and I guess a little pale, but you can see it, the range is only in California, so gray pine is one of those endemics. It's not a really tall pine, up to maybe 80 feet tall, up to 3 feet in diameter, although again that would be a fairly large old gray pine. The largest is actually 161 feet and almost 6 inches in diameter, and it actually is in the Redding area. But again, that's a very large old tree. These have kind of brittle bark, and so they are prone to breaking, during windstorms and falling over. So it is pretty rare that you get a really old one. And a lot of times they just get cut down because people think they're ugly. Their cones are fire adapted, or what we would call serotinous, or at least semi-serotinous. 8 inches or more. I've had examples that were probably closer to almost a foot long, and again, several pounds in weight. Serotinous cones in general, and we'll talk about some other ones, have really dense scales. So they tend to be very heavy. And then also the resin that you can see on the tips here, the yellowish stuff is all the resin. And that resin also helps kind of glue the scales together. And why we call it a fire-adapted or serotinous cone is that these are species that live in areas that are prone to fire, like the foothills around most of California. And obviously if the fire completely killed the tree and completely burnt up the cone, there'd be no seeds, the species wouldn't exist. So these really dense cones and the resin kind of gluing the scales together, although a fire may kill the tree, the adult tree, enough of the seeds tend to survive inside of the cone. And then the fire actually triggers the cone or melts the resin so that those seeds can be released. And now you've got these seeds that can be released, and now they've got a nice open space where the fire has come through, killed other plants, decreasing competition. So now these trees have all the space and nutrients from the fire and the water probably that they need. Knobcone, I think I said bishop a minute ago. So the knobcone pine cones are still serotinous. They're dense. They're tightly closed. And again, this is a tree that basically depends on fire for it to regenerate. Fire might come through and kill the adult trees, but again, leaves a bunch of open space. The seeds survive, and then they can start growing back. And what you'll typically see with the knobcone forest is a forest of trees that are often almost exactly the same height and size in every way, because they all started at the same time after a fire. Again, remember the word serotinous means basically, or has to do with being fire adapted, and that the cones remain kind of glued shut until the seeds are fully mature. And then again, that cone protects the seed against fire. We look at a two-needle pine now called lodgepole. This is a higher elevation species, although there is another version of lodgepole, another subspecies that actually exists along the coast from northern corner of California in Del Norte County, southward a bit. But then also it exists up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, up typically above maybe 6,000 to 8,000 feet. Again, these are also a serotinous species, a fire-adapted species with really small cones that take 2 full years to mature. So the cones start growing and developing. At some point they're fertilized. The scales of the cone close then and protect the seeds as they're developing. And then, again, when the right conditions occur, which typically is following a fire, those seeds would be released. Also very small needles compared to the two pines we just looked at. These are only maybe 1 to 2 inches in length. And again, these are in bundles of 2. They're also a species that's called a type of pine tree that's considered to be intolerant, meaning they don't like shade. They like being out in the open sun. If a seed happens to land under the shade of another tree, it may survive and it may grow a little bit, but it'll never grow very well because it really does need full sun. And although the cone survives fire, the tree itself has very thin bark, and it really is easily killed by fire. But again, that's actually the strategy. The adult trees get killed, but their seeds survive to make a new generation. These are also relatively small trees. They're also kind of twisted, and even though we may use them for things like fence posts, again, they're not really much of a timber species because of how small they are, and also because, again, they're very, very twisted. See, the range of the lodgepole pine is much more widely spread in California, but even more abundant up in Washington and all the way up to near Alaska, throughout western Canada, and then also in the Rocky Mountains, from the northern Rockies down into Wyoming and Colorado, not quite as far south as Arizona or New Mexico. Again, short needles that are in bundles of 2, relatively small little cone. And you can see by looking at that cone, there's a tiny little, what we refer to as a prickle on it. Just a little pointy structure on the end of the scales that help keep animals from getting in to get at the seeds. It doesn't stop a chipmunk or a bird from getting at the seeds, but it helps a little bit to prevent that predation on the seeds. So much more widespread than the other species. Again, lodgepole is not endemic to California because it's found throughout the western U.S. and Canada. Next, on to a species that is also widely spread throughout the western U.S., and it's also a very important timber species. Because it's so abundant, because it grows straight and very tall, large diameters, it is a sought-after species from the standpoint of making wood products. So ponderosa pine's a 3-needle pine that has fairly distinctive bark. We often or sometimes refer to the patterns on the bark as puzzle pieces. You can also note the cone looks a little bit like a lodgepole pine cone, and it also has those little prickles on the end of it. Again, prickles are just a little bit of a defense mechanism to help keep critters from getting in there and eating all the seeds. So you see ponderosa is a little more widely spread, maybe not as far north as, say, lodgepole, but it occurs much farther south, all the way into Mexico, and even farther east into Texas and North and South Dakota. It's in so Pinus ponderosa. I'm not sure if I mentioned the Latin names for the other species, but you can certainly find those in the book. And it'd be nice if all the Latin names were as easy as this, right? Ponderosa pine, Pinus ponderosa. Fortunately, not all that easy. So this is a much more massive pine than the other ones we've looked at so far. Longer needles in groups of 3. Cones are bigger than lodgepole, around 5 inches or so. On average, these trees easily grow well over 100 feet. The oldest, or the old, I guess I don't know the very oldest, but they can easily get into the hundreds of years old, 600 plus years old, a very long-lived tree. Again, the largest is up in the North State in Trinity County. That's well over 200 feet tall and 94 inches in diameter. These are species that are found in the, it says lower to upper montane. So you start around here anyway, in the northern part of California, you start finding ponderosa pine down, say, around 2,500 feet of elevation. Certainly they can be lower, but right around that elevation on up to maybe 6,000 feet or so is the typical range that you find them at. They're in what's called a mixed conifer forest. That's the most common habitat type in the mountains around California. Mixed conifer meaning ponderosa pine, incense cedar, white fir, sugar pine, and then also things like black oak, for example. As with most pines, it is also intolerant of shade. So again, they like to grow in full sunlight, and they are a bit more fire resistant. They have thicker bark. Again, fires can kill them, so they're not completely fireproof, but the thicker bark does make them a little more fire resistant. Their cones are not in any way serotinous, so these trees do not depend on fire for reproduction. and fire, does actually burn these cones and kill them. A related species, and probably back in time, Jeffrey pine and ponderosa pine probably both originated from the same species. Ponderosa pine evolved to live at slightly lower elevations with, again, the other trees that I mentioned, whereas Pinus jeffreyi evolved to live at slightly higher elevations, 6, 7, 8,000 feet, with different species of trees, red fir primarily, and the winter's a little longer, more snow, that kind of thing. Pine cones are similar, but yet there are some obvious differences. The Jeffrey pine cone is larger than ponderosa. You can kind of maybe tell that from this person holding it. A couple other subtle differences. There are still these little prickles on the Jeffrey pine. The difference is on the Jeffrey pine, those prickles kind of point inward. They're incurved. So if you put your hand on that cone, you don't really feel the prickles. Conversely, if you have a ponderosa pine cone and you grab it, the prickles point outward, so you can feel the prickles if you were to grab a ponderosa pine cone. And there are some other subtle differences, but that would be enough between higher elevation and the prickles pointing inward to let you know it's a Jeffrey pine rather than ponderosa. Real similar otherwise to a ponderosa, tall, fairly large in diameter. They live long. They're not as widely spread as ponderosa pine. They aren't quite endemic to California. You can see they occur up in Oregon a little bit. They creep into Nevada. They creep down into Mexico. So not nearly as widespread, but they're still also intolerant, fire resistant, and found throughout the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains, whereas ponderosa generally is more abundant on the western side of the Sierra Nevada. The other interesting thing, if you walk up to a pine and it's 3 needles, and you look at the cone and you're not really sure if it's ponderosa or Jeffrey, and unfortunately they don't all have this characteristic, but the ones in the Sierra Nevada mountain, if you kind of peel away or just scratch at the bark, it has a very distinct vanilla smell, whereas ponderosa does not have that. If we go back down in elevation just a little bit, where we have the ponderosa pine, we also have the sugar pine, Pinus lambertiana. This is actually a 5-needle pine, shorter needles. Notice the bark is just kind of, scaly looking, I guess. It's not those kind of separate puzzle pieces like ponderosa and Jeffrey pine. Very distinct pine cones. They're very long. They can be in excess of up to, say, 3 feet or so. I've actually found cones that were a little bit over 3 feet long. They're not heavy like digger pine, but very large cones. Very large trees as well. On average, the cones are easily 18 inches, but again, they can get much larger than that. Again, same size roughly, although again the largest is actually well over 250 feet tall in the Yosemite National Park area. These occur in the same elevations roughly as ponderosa pine, but also a little bit higher than that as well. Again, intolerant of shade, fire resistant bark, shorter needles than ponderosa or Jeffrey pine. And these are actually the world's largest and tallest pines. Again, the largest is 270 feet tall. I don't recall the diameter, but very large trees. They can easily, you look at historic photographs, trees that are alive or that were cut down It wouldn't be it wouldn't be it wouldn't be atypical to see sugar pines that were 10 feet or more in diameter. So again, that's not a round, that's wide, basically 10 feet across. Very, very large, awesome trees. Plus, I talked about the pine nuts being food for humans and certainly a really important source of food for wildlife. I think, anyway, that the sugar pine nuts are probably the tastiest of all of them. If you find a cone that's relatively recently fallen on the ground and it's actually got the pine nuts in there, they're large, they're actually really kind of moist, not in a bad way, they aren't dry, in other words. And they really have a good flavor. They're really, really a tasty pine nut to forage on if you're ever out in the woods and are lucky enough to find a freshly fallen cone. We've got a lot of, if you're interested in trees, and it's not that hard to get interested in trees if you really just spend time outside and read a little bit about them. We've got a lot of interesting ones in California. Maybe one of the more interesting ones, at least from my perspective, is the bristlecone pine. These are trees that are found at the highest elevations. In California, you have to go the other side of the Sierra Nevada mountains down towards Lone Pine or Bishop. And then if you go up in the, not the Sierra Nevada mountains, but the White Mountains out east of Lone Pine, there's a road that goes up into an area where there's campgrounds and visitor center. But the road goes up and dead ends at about, well, it goes up to about 10,000 feet. Then you can drive another gnarly kind of gravelly road up to about 11,000 feet or so in elevation. And there are trails up there that you can hike to see the bristlecones. They're in really dry, rocky habitats, places that you wouldn't think could support much of any kind of life, what we call the subalpine habitat. So again, right at the very highest elevations, you don't really see living things much higher than the elevations these bristlecones exist at. Farther east, they also exist in the Great Basin area between that kind of extends into Nevada and Utah. Very small cones, short needles. Again, geez, I lost track of it. I think they're also in bundles of 5. Really short trees like the one pictured here. And again, you have to, if you've never been up to this kind of habitat, it really is, again, something we all ought to do. Go around towards Mount Whitney, drive through the Alabama hills, lots of interesting rocks and natural rock arches. Drive up to the visitor center in Mount Whitney, lots of neat stuff up there. But then again, if you head east out of Lone Pine up into the bristlecone habitat, just a really interesting ecosystem. And again, you have to kind of be up there to really appreciate it. Of course, the air is thin for us, but for trees, the more important thing is that the growing season is really short. There are years when the snow never completely melts because you're right up there near where the glaciers start. So because of how nasty the habitat is and how nasty the weather is, lots of snow, tens of feet of snow on the ground in the winter, 30, 40 feet maybe in some cases, strong winds. You can see this tree looks like it's kind of leaning over to the right. That's because it's been shaped by hundreds and hundreds of years of snow and wind. These are the oldest living things, maybe the most interesting thing about them. They have been determined to be in excess of 4,000 years old. The oldest one, which is in the area that I was just talking about, up above Lone Pine, is something like 5,500 years old. It's crazy to think when that tree, let's just say the one we're looking at was 3,000 years old. 3,000 years that tree has survived, and dealt with, better weather, worse weather, droughts, maybe years when it was buried under snow, never thawed out, that it could survive that long just, again, amazes me. A lot of these, as they get much older, like this one pictured on the left, and I'm not sure if this is I think this might be the tree, the Methuselah tree, that is documented to be the very oldest one. You notice there's a lot of part of this tree that is dead. Still alive, we've still got green needles, but a lot of the bark has just been worn away. Lots of the branches are gone at this point. Just again, think about all of what this tree has had to survive. Fairly large seeds, even though it's a small cone. Some of the few sources of food up at the highest elevation for some species of birds, like the Clark's nutcracker. Really depends on these seeds in the summertime, or at least when they're accessible. Some of the smaller critters that exist at these highest elevations also depend heavily on those seeds. Got the western white pine, that's a close relative to the sugar pine. Again, more of a long cone, although not nearly as large as sugar pine. Another 5-needle pine, and also again another tree that's very large. Sugar pine occurs at lower elevation. Western white pine up above, say, 8,000 feet or so. Kind of similar to the idea of the Ponderosa and Jeffrey being related and separated by elevation. Same thing with the sugar pine and the western white pine. Very similar species, probably one species in the distant past, separated by elevation at this point. Tend to be shorter than the sugar pine. Up in the much higher elevation, even up to the subalpine. Again, shade and fire intolerant. Also, again, long-lived. As with the sugar pine, western white pine are both valuable timber species. They're in the white pine category, as opposed to, we were talking about the Ponderosa being a yellow pine. Just the slight tint of the wood, more whitish in these trees, more yellowish in Ponderosa and Jeffrey. So all four of these trees, Ponderosa, Jeffrey, sugar, and western white, are all important timber species. Tall, straight trees, good, strong grain. We use them for a lot of wood products. Another high elevation species that is another one of those endemics that also is found in what we have in California that we refer to as serpentine soils. Kind of infertile, really, again, kind of unique soil types that we have in California. Kind of two separate population groups. One you see kind of in the southern Sierra Nevada, and then one up in the southern Cascades, up in the Marble Mountain Wilderness area, Six Rivers National Forest. I've seen the foxtails down in there, and also in northern California. Again, probably a species that existed along the entire Sierra Nevada and southern Cascades. So probably a much more widely spread species that over time has been slowly declining, probably because of how the climate may have changed over that period of time. Having two populations that are very much separate from each other are probably good indicators that there was once a much bigger population that again has been declining for whatever reason, possibly again normal kind of natural climate change. Higher elevation, harsh climates, those are going to be maybe the only source of food that sustains whatever wildlife exists there. Now we go over to the coast. Got Monterey pine, named after the county, that part of the state where they're the most abundant. These are a little more like the gray pine in that they can be multiple stemmed, irregular shape, not just a nice straight tall pine like the last several we talked about. They're a lot shorter lived, and they're more prone to picking up diseases. They don't do well when you try to plant them other places. They're really adapted to the coastal kind of climate. Not very tall, because again they can be impacted by the constant wind that you tend to get along the coastline. So the constant wind blowing the tree, similar to what you would get at the high elevation, but obviously not nearly as harsh. So they're medium-sized trees, largest existing in Napa County. They have cones that are back in that category of being serotinous, and they're also persistent. They don't just grow and develop and then fall off the tree. They can stay on the tree for years, which again is not typical of all pine trees. It's a little more typical of the ones that are serotinous, where they may stay on the tree and kind of wait until there's a fire. And so they can persist for relatively long periods of time, waiting for the right conditions for reproduction, which again is going to be a fire. It's kind of hard to tell looking at the slide here, but they're also what we would call asymmetrical. All the other cones we've looked at, if you were to stand them up in front of you, you look at them from all sides and they pretty much look the same. These, where it's mostly noticeable, is if you look at the bottom of the cone where it attaches to the tree. It's offset, it's not right in the center. Egg-shaped, again, you can see they're whorled around the branch, means they attach in a circle around the branch of the stem of the tree. The Monterey pine is a relatively rare species. It's found in only 3 populations that are not connected below 1,400 feet along the coast to right up against the coastline. Again, another endemic species, if I didn't already mention that. See a map here of where those populations exist. We've, again, got population on kind of the central coast, and then basically 2 islands down around Baja. Kind of zoom into the central coast, where we've got those 3 populations are around Cambria, north of San Luis Obispo, in other words, around the Monterey Peninsula, and then in a smaller little population north of Santa Cruz. Again, probably given the extent of the north-south range of the species, it was probably, again, much more abundant in the past, and has slowly been dying back, perhaps because of the diseases that it's prone to. So there's also, I'm trying to think here if I missed any, there's coulter pine, there's white bark pine, trying to think if I'm missing any other ones that are not very abundant, and you could also look those up if you choose to, but the ones we've covered are typically the most interesting, or the ones that have timber value, for example. Now we'll look at the group that are in the true fir category, the genus Abies. 7 of the 10 that are found in North America are actually found in California. Like several of the pines, tall, straight, trunked trees with very dome-like crowns. The firs, unlike the pines, which like kind of open, sunny, drier conditions, the firs tend to like cooler, moister types of habitats. Short needles that are directly on the branch. They're not in clusters. They're singly, individually attached. And the cones are erect rather than pendulous, so they point upward on the branches rather than kind of dangling like most of the pines do downward. First one we'll look at is AB's concolor, the white fir, which is found in the same habitats as ponderosa pine and sugar pine, so the mixed conifer forest. Has a smoother bark than the pines do, although you'll see these resin pockets here, these little bumps on the tree, but smoother bark. Again, individual needles attached directly to the branch, upright pointing cones that, again, you can tell look different than the pines. Whereas the pine members of the genus Pinus had scales that kind of attached to a main stem, the true firs have scales that are almost kind of like just big round scales that are just stacked on top of each other. If you've ever found a white fir cone on the ground and you pick it up, they just tend to crumble apart. So it's almost like a stack of plates. Imagine, you have a bunch of plates all stacked on top of each other. That's kind of the way the cones are arranged. In the white fir, needles are around 2 inches and more of a blue-gray color. As you saw on the previous slide, whitish bark, barrel-shaped cones. These are actually tolerant, which again means they can and prefer to be in the shade rather than in the sun like pines. They're somewhat fire resistant, although certainly the cones are not considered to be serotinous. And they exist in a wide range of elevation, but again, typical of what we call the mixed conifer forest. Pretty abundant in California, and then also we find them in the mountains of Arizona, New Mexico, and then from Colorado and a little bit in Utah. Lower elevation, red fir is at elevations above where you find white fir. Red fir is actually either found all by itself, so in a single species forest, or you will typically find it along with lodgepole pine. Again, single needles, erect cones, fairly large, straight trees. Needles are a little different looking, a little more hockey stick shaped. They've got kind of a hockey stick shape. A little hard to tell from the image, but you see as if that was the bottom of the hockey stick, the part where you actually hit the puck, and then the handle goes up. Red fir is not nearly as widespread, sort of just the central to northern Sierra Nevada, and then up into the southern Cascades, but it doesn't really exist in anywhere east of California, maybe just a tiny bit into Nevada there. Again, higher elevation than white fir, also more or less shade tolerant. They actually like a little more sun than white fir, but still considered shade tolerant. AB's concolor is the white fir, and I'm pausing because I forgot the species of red fir. Started into this section, just kind of working on my memory, and you'll find as you get older, your memory does not always kind of want to work with you at times. But again, you can look that up if you want the Latin name. I do know the Latin name for Douglas fir, and it's Pseudotsuga, so it's a false fir. It's not a true fir like red and white fir. Pseudotsuga menziesii. Interesting cone. Again, it's more scale-like. It doesn't have the stacked plate look that white and red fir do. And it's also got what we call a bract, which is a little paper structure. If you look at the bract and you trace it inside the cone, basically the bract is the papery covering that goes around the seed. So pretty much all pines and firs have bract, B-R-A-C-T, that covers the seed. Most of them you don't see, though. In the case of the Doug fir, the bract actually sticks outside of the scales of the cone. And in this case, you can maybe just barely make it out. It's got a 3-prong bract. So there are 3 little points. And again, if you trace that inside the scales of the cone, that's the seed is part of that, basically. Again, nice, tall, straight, long-lived trees, single needles that basically we say it has a bottle brush arrangement. The needles come out of all 365 degrees around the branch, whereas if you look at the red and the white fir, they come out basically like airplane wings, sort of opposite sides of the branch from each other. But Doug fir, they come out all around the branch, making it kind of look like a bottle brush. So as I said, Doug fir is not a true fir, but it does grow large. It has fire-resistant bark. Most widespread in the northern coastal counties of California, but also into the northern Sierra Nevada, through central Sierra. It probably does. This map might be a little hard to interpret. There are Doug fir down into the mountains above Fresno, but that's about as far south as it goes. But you can see again, it's concentrated very heavily along the coastal areas, and then also into the northern Rockies, and scattered at various places in the mid or higher elevations. It's also typical of areas that we refer to as old growth forests. Areas of forest that have been basically left alone with respect to, say, logging or building, homes and cities and whatnot. And so basically areas that have old trees, but it's also a little bit of you have to be careful. A lot of people define old growth as just big old trees. What an old growth forest really is just a forest that we've pretty much left alone. So obviously an old growth forest has to have baby trees, right? It has to have saplings. It has to have small little seedlings. Otherwise, you don't get old trees without young trees, right? So an old growth forest is really just a forest that has all ages of trees and basically has been left alone. Some of those rare species that we find associated with old growth forests of Doug fir or things like the giant sequoia, coast redwood trees, but even large old sugar pines are things like our northern spotted owl, a still endangered species of bird that we find in California, coastal all the way through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and species that that's protected and was kind of species that's been used as a reason for maintaining our old growth forests. Another species that's more coastal is the marbled murrelet. It's kind of an ocean-going bird that you would typically find out in the ocean, but unlike a lot of other ocean-going birds that maybe go to an island or a beach or cliffs along an ocean to nest, and these come inland a little ways and nest up in the redwoods or in these really large, tall, old Doug fir. And so it's also a protected species that is dependent, at least as far as we know, on these old growth forests.